May I just say at the beginning that we are recording this, if you're happy with that, and we'll be putting it up on YouTube as soon as we've got the recording into a proper order. And at the end, there will be a short Q&A, and either you can register your questions in the chat box or simply put your hand up and in the normal way. May I say at the beginning that we all regret not meeting in person. Nevertheless, the Zooming phenomenon does enable us to hold such events like this with, I think in a way, a worldwide audience. And certainly we now enjoy the privilege of having this talk by Professor Michael Cherry, and we're delighted for that. And may I now hand to Robert, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Robert, please.
Good evening, everyone, and especially to our speaker, Mike. Mike is currently a professor in the University of Stellenbosch, South Africa. And he was born in Cape Town and attended UCT as an undergraduate at the University of Cape Town. In 1984, he started a DPhil at Balliol College, Oxford, on sexual selection and mating systems in 2 species of toads, obtaining his degree in 1989. He then took up a curatorial position in the South African Museum in Cape Town, becoming curator of herpetology and ornithology. In 1995, he moved to the University of Stellenbosch, where he has remained since. He's published a large array of papers on a diversity of topics relating to vertebrate ecology, behavior, and conservation, and in recent years has been closely involved in research into the bird life of the forests of the Eastern Cape, on which I am happy to say that he will be speaking to us tonight. Over to you, Mike.
Well, thanks, Rob and Chris, for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking to you this evening about our recent research, which has investigated forest-dependent bird declines in South Africa. And I must emphasize this has been conducted with 3 of my graduate students, Jessica Lever, Jake Mulvaney, and Tessa Cooper. So Tessa was the one who started it off about 6 or 7 years ago. She did some work using occupancy modeling, which is a technique which you don't really need to know too much about, and shown that half of South Africa's 58 forest-dependent bird species have experienced range declines in the last 30 years, and mostly in the former Transkei and Ciskei homelands of one of our 9 provinces, the Eastern Cape Province. So we published this paper based on her MSc 5 years ago, and this work was based on observations made by birders and citizen scientists contributing to the South African Bird Atlas project. And here you can see some of the species which have had declining ranges over the past 30 years. So here you've got a starred robin with a range decline of 23%, a lemon dove with a range decline of 28%, buff-spotted flufftail with one of 29%, yellow-throated woodland warbler, 21%, and a spotted ground thrush with 28% decline. So forests are a very small biome in South Africa, and they're largely confined to our eastern seaboard, which is relatively wet. Most of the country is pretty dry. And then along the base of the Drakensberg Mountains here. And ecologically, the Eastern Cape Province is significant as it contains 46% of South Africa's remaining indigenous forest cover. And this is mostly in the Ciskei, which is in this area here, and then the Transkei, which is in that area there. And what is significant is that both of these areas have always been under communal land tenure. So they were areas that, although they were controlled by the colonial government, they weren't settled by commercial farmers. I'm can't resist noting, seeing that this is the British Ornithologists Club, the second greatest proportion of forest, 29%, is in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. And here you can see it's very fragmented, no sort of nice big blocks like you get in the Eastern Cape. And the reason is that about 85% of this province's forest was lost, mostly due to replacement by sugarcane by white commercial farmers in the century after it was declared a British colony in 1840. So if I'd been giving this talk 200 years ago, a lot more of the forest would have been in KwaZulu-Natal. But these areas, because they were under communal land tenure with small-scale peasant farmers, most of the forests were relatively well preserved. So where exactly are these forest birds disappearing? And what this map shows you is the 9 provinces of South Africa, and it shows sites that experienced a loss of 20% or more forest-dependent bird species between the 2 South African Bird Atlas projects. So the first of these was run from 1987 to 1992, and the second one started in 2007, and 15 years on it is still ongoing. But for the purposes of our study, we ended our data collection and extraction from the project in 2015. Now, all these sites here, all these blocks have had those losses, but the filled-in sites are ones that actually experienced a loss of indigenous forest during this period. And the gray shaded area here is just of note because this area is now in KwaZulu-Natal, but it was formerly, before the demise of apartheid and the advent of democracy, part of the Transkei. And of course, our first reaction was to assume that you've got declining forest birds, this must mean that you've got forest loss. But this turned out largely not to be the case. So only 5 of these grid squares nationally had experienced net forest loss, and only 2 out of the 20 in the Ciskei and the former Transkei, which is the area of the major declines, range declines, had experienced forest loss. So this here shows you just graphically, here on your x-axis, you've got each of those grid squares you saw in the previous slide. Don't worry about that column for the moment. Here you've got your species down here. And this shows you the pattern of loss between SABAP 1 and SABAP 2. So the red cells indicate sites from which a species was lost between the first Atlas reporting period and the second. The blue cells indicate a site that was newly colonized. In other words, it was reported in the second period, but not in the first. And the yellow cells indicate sites within which a species was stable. And you can see there are not that many of those. The gray sites, of course, are ones where a site in which the species was not found in either Atlas period, so it's essentially extralimital. So forest cover in South Africa is not decreasing like it is in most of the developing world, it's increasing. And this is a bit of a paradox. The reason it's increasing is because of de-agrarianization. So in communal land tenure areas, people are farming much less. And in the entire Eastern Cape province, there in fact has been an 18% increase in forest cover in the period between 1992 and this year. This figure shows just the Transkei area, and in red you've got the 1990 national land cover designated as indigenous forest and additional forest detected by the national land cover in 2013, 2014. So in other words, 23, 24 years later in green. So why is this happening? Well, people are farming much less in communal land tenure areas. This pie chart shows sources of income in rural villages in 2 of 4 Transkei regions studied by Megiddo and Shackleton, which is a group at Rhodes University in Makanda. And if you look at this chart, you'll see that agriculture, that's livestock and crops combined, comprises only between 5 and 9% of income. Non-timber forest products, by contrast, provide over double this, between 12% and 20%. And the big yellow part on the chart is, since the advent of democracy in 1994, by far the most important source of social income has been social grants. And this comprises 3 different types. So the first and perhaps most important thing was in 1993. In fact, the National Party government, the old government, equalized old age pensions for indigent people across all races in an attempt to court the black vote. And that was the first thing. And a lot of people who live in these communal land tenure areas are older people. And then subsequently to that, the new government has introduced a child support grant for mothers of children below a certain income level, and then quite an extensive disability grant system. And the upshoot of this is that South Africa has now got, in the developing world, probably the biggest social security system that exists. So the Eastern Cape, of course, is one of South Africa's least developed provinces. It's characterized by poor infrastructure, high levels of unemployment, and rural poverty. And forest products thus make an important contribution to rural livelihoods in this region, with a particular demand for 3 things. First is poles, the second medicinal plants, and in the coastal forests for timber as well. Now, another very interesting thing is that these fields that are being abandoned are not really abandoned altogether, because they are harvested. So again, the Rhodes Group published a very interesting paper 3 years ago, and they worked on a mosaic of abandoned fields of different ages from 1961 onwards in the Willowvale area of the Transkei. So the date 1961 is interesting to me because it's the date my sister was born, and I was born 2 years before that. So this is a process that's been taking place for over 60 years. So I did mention in the previous slide that this is something that's been greatly accelerated since the advent of democracy 28 years ago, but it's a process that started well before then. So all lands not used for homesteads or cultivation are open to all residents for grazing of domestic livestock and collection of non-timber forest products. In the early stages of field deactivation, they may remain the property of the household because of the possibility that they may recultivate it at some stage. But with prolonged lack of cultivation, the old field becomes accessible to all. And then interestingly, the number of non-timber forest product species increased with increasing age of the former field. So the youngest fields had more medicinal species than the older ones. And as the abundance and diversity of herbaceous species declined with increasing woody plant cover. And then species used for building and food, especially fruits, peaked when the former fields become dominated by woody plants, and NTFPs used for craft were most abundant in the oldest sites. So very interestingly, you get, as plant succession takes place in these regenerating forests, you get harvesting of different suites of forest products. So some of the non-timber forest products are harvested from former agricultural lands, which are now regenerating forests. But we've worked in this study that I'm going to talk to you about in primary forests. Now, the trade in medicinal plants is perhaps most clearly represents the commercialization of forest products in South Africa. So this is currently a multi-billion rand industry, but it's hidden within the informal sector. So forests have been harvested since the appearance of humans, initially by hunter-gatherers and then subsequently by Negroid people who settled this area in the KZN and the Eastern Cape from about 780 onwards. But with urbanization, and the country is now 2/3 urbanized, the advent of supply networks has caused a transition from subsistence scale to commercial scale informal harvesting. And it's important to remember that 2/3 of the South African population now resides in urban areas, but of course, there are trade networks spanning the country, and traditional healers are used, or usually in combination with conventional medicine. So people use the two in tandem by about 3/4 of South Africans. So in contrast, what's the legal situation with regard to harvesting in indigenous forests? So in 1940, all harvesting of indigenous forests was terminated, except for informal collection of only a headload of dead wood for firewood. And this, in fact, was a 19th century colonial regulation which had been retained, and then it was retained after Union, and then again by the apartheid government after 1948. And then from 1975 on, the state has harvested timber sustainably in only the two largest forest blocks, Knysna, which in fact is the one bit of forest in the Western Cape, and then the Amatole in the Eastern Cape. And then in 1998, the new government passed what on paper was an extremely good act called the Forest Act, which provides in principle for sustainable informal harvesting through participatory forest management. And it took them another 10 years to promulgate regulations for subsistence harvesting. And in terms of these regulations, in terms of the Act, forest officers who are in charge of each forest block, they're empowered to make exemptions for members of local communities, finding us living within 10 kilometers, to harvest medicinal plants and bark under the supervision of a forester or forest guard, but only for household consumption. So resale is prohibited. And then a year after that, regulations regarding commercial foresting were promulgated. And in terms of those regulations, anybody who's going to resell products is actually required to get a license, which must be issued at the regional forest office at the discretion of the regional director for that province. Now, in practice, no commercial permits have been issued in the Eastern Cape since these regulations were promulgated in 2009. So theoretically, all harvesting that's taking place is in fact for subsistence or household use. But 2009, some of you may know, is coincidentally the year when Jacob Zuma became president. And from 2013, so a few years later, all forest officer posts that have become vacant, so for a decade now, have been frozen. And of course, this whole participatory forest management is dependent on having forest officers. So we decided to study the effects of harvesting on primary forests, so not the regenerating forests that I hope are going to form a focus of a future study. And we decided to use birds to look at this. So why are birds good indicators of biodiversity? Well, disturbance has long been thought to influence ecosystem function through changes in species composition and species interactions. And birds are good indicators of the general effects of disturbance on biodiversity because they inhabit different strata of the forest, and they occupy a range of feeding niches, and they're also very important in ecosystem processes such as pollination and seed dispersal. So our key questions were, what is the nature and extent of forest product harvesting in indigenous forests in the Eastern Cape? Does this affect avian biodiversity? And how could harvesting be managed? And we aimed us to assess the nature and extent of harvesting and how these activities affect measures of bird taxonomic and functional diversity. So we selected 6 study forests within the Eastern Cape. So you can see in this map, each of these colors represents a different sub-ecotype. So these 6 forests were Mkaba, which is here in the Ponderland Scarp, Tlaboya, which is in the Eastern Cape Dune Forest, Manubi, which is in the Transkei Scarp. Those are all coastal forests. And then on what we call the mistbelt forests at the foot of the Drakensberg, the Amatoli mistbelt forests here, forest is called Piri. And then we had 2 in the Transkei mistbelt, one at a place called Ngadu, and then another at Gomo. The reason we took 2 here is that Ngadu is somewhat unusual in that the indigenous forest is embedded in a matrix with plantation forests. So we took one in addition, which was separate. So all these forests represent open access state managed forests. So they're conserved in theory, but they're not fenced. Often minor regional roads, gravel roads often, for example, run through them. But this category of forest comprises 70% of South Africa's forests. These forests were all larger than 400 hectares and had 2 or more local communities less than 3 kilometers from the forest boundary. We didn't investigate the Albany coastal forest down here in the south because they're very, very well protected and conserved in terms of a large proportion of them fall within formally fenced reserves, so they're not really at risk from harvesting. So we had a system of circular plots sampled to assess harvesting and the bird community. So within each study forest, we got 16 survey sites containing a minimum difference of 150 meters between the sites. And they comprise circular plots of 400 square meters within which all the harvesting activities were recorded, and the bird community was sampled by a mix of fixed radius point counts conducted early in the morning. And the sampling was conducted in the winter, in other words, non-breeding season. In total, 80 sites were sampled across 6 study forests. And you'll recall that sampling revealed these 3 different key forest products. So poles, which are used for building and fencing, they're harvested from understory trees with a diameter of less than 20 centimeters, so saplings. And we developed a pole harvesting index, which represents the proportion of the available resource that's been harvested in the park. So this is calculated as the number of stumps. In other words, the harvested portion divided by the number of stumps plus the number of live hillside stems. And second, timber is harvested primarily in the coastal forests from canopy trees. We define those as with a diameter greater than 20 centimeters, and added with pole harvesting, the extent of timber harvesting in each plot was calculated as the proportion of available trees that had been harvested. And lastly, medicinal bark is harvested from trees with a diameter greater than 10 centimeters. And to measure the impact of bark harvesting at each survey site, the proportion of canopy trees dying from bark harvesting, in other words, ringbark snags, was calculated. So this work was conducted by 2 PhD students, mostly Jessica Lever with here, some assistance from Jake Mulvaney. He's looking very happy because we just caught a chorister robin chat, which is one of his favorite birds in the net. And we decided to measure what we call functional diversity as well as taxonomic species diversity. And I'm just going to try and take a minute or 2 to explain why this was important, why we did this. So traditionally, responses to disturbance have been investigated using measures of taxonomic species diversity, in which case the diversity of this community would comprise the 4 species that we have here. So the Cape parrot, the olive woodpecker, the crowned eagle, and the lemon dove, all forest-dependent species. But taxonomic diversity is a crude measure because what habitat serves disturbances usually do is create opportunities for new species to colonize. So often species richness after a disturbance remains constant or can even increase despite community structure having changed dramatically. And about 20 years ago, people, theoretical ecologists thinking about this, recognized the importance of functional trait diversity as it provides a more direct link between species diversity and ecosystem function. And this is because functional diversity measures the range, abundance, and distribution of functional trait values in a community, allowing us to score species along a continuum of dissimilarity. So functional diversity thus considers the complementarity and redundancy of co-occurring species and allows us to gain a more accurate picture of the resources collectively available to the species in a community. And identification of the drivers of functional diversity can therefore provide insight into the vulnerability of ecosystems to environmental change. So how does this work? So we've got exactly our same 4 species that we had in the previous slide, but we say, okay, so in terms of the functional trait diet, the parrot is a frugivore, the lemon dove is a granivore, the woodpecker is an insectivore, ground eagle is a carnivore. The second trait that we looked at here is the kind of nested birds. So olive woodpecker is a primary cavity nester, Cape parrot's a secondary cavity nester, so it can't excavate its own holes. The lemon dove does and the crown eagle both do platform nests. So what we get across all our species, so the next step is to quantify the functional diversity of at each site based on an array of traits from the bird community data collected. So we chose 7 traits with influence, resource acquisition, and resource use, because we were wanting to look at the link between diversity and ecosystem function. And here they are. So body mass, clutch size, food type, foraging strategy, foraging location, nest type, and migratory status. So remember, we did our study in the winter. So in fact, we're dealing only with altitudinal migrants versus residents, because what you get in some cases are birds that move between coastal forests and the mist-belt forest, depending on the season. So the most basic of these functional diversity indices is called functional richness. And that's simply the amount of niche space occupied by the species. So these 2 histograms, for example, indicate the summed abundance of species occurring in each functional trait value of a hypothetical trait. So the vertical dotted lines indicate the amount of niche space by the species together. So the graph on the left illustrates higher functional richness than the graph on the right, which shows unoccupied niche space, basically, there and there. So this unoccupied niche space reduces resource exploitation, by, in this case, birds in the system, thereby reducing ecosystem productivity. And we found that avian functional diversity was negatively affected by informal harvesting, although traditional measures of species diversity showed no association with all 3 harvesting variables. And this we published 3 years ago in the journal Forest Ecology and Management. So we in fact measured various functional matrices, but I'll just go through the simplest one of these to illustrate the concept. So for example, here we've got the harvesting variables represented along the x-axis and the corresponding bird response variable along the y-axis. And pearl harvesting was the only factor which on its own had an effect on functional diversity. So functional richness was negatively associated with pearl harvesting, which you can see on the right. That's a significant relationship. But if you looked at the effect of species richness, of pearl harvesting on species richness, there's no significant effect. And that indicates that pole harvesting may drive a change in species composition without any overall loss or gain in species, and that as pole harvesting intensity increases, the amount of occupied niche space will decline, despite the fact that there's no apparent gain, loss or gain in species. Now, this is unsurprising, as pole harvesting historically has been the most widespread form of harvesting. So the graph on the top left here shows the 3 measured forest products along the x-axis and the percentage of plots out of those 80 plots in which they were recorded along the y-axis. And pole harvesting was observed in 60%, timber harvesting in only 27%, and bark harvesting in 57%, so almost as high as pole harvesting. But ringbark snags, in other words, standing dead trees, in 39% of the 80 survey sites. And the graph below shows the average harvesting levels, not the number of plots that had harvesting in them, but the levels of harvesting. So 7% of pole-sized stems were harvested on average, whereas timber and bark had both had a mean harvest rate of 4%, with a mean of just over 1% of trees dying from bark harvesting. Now, bark harvesting, of course, can be done sustainably, but 29% of trees harvested bark across the 80 sites were ringbark, which means the trees are harvested, bark is removed around the circumference of a tree, and the tree will eventually die. So here you've got the frequency of the most commonly encountered species harvested poles, represented as a proportion of identified species. So the light gray bars here represent lowland species from the coastal forests, and the dark gray bars represent montane species. And you can see that pole harvesting is very widespread, with different species being more commonly harvested in montane and coastal areas. So white witch hazel, which is this species here, silverleaf milk plum, and red bitterberry were the most common, more than 10% harvested species. So poles, as I said, are used for kraals, so for fencing, and traditionally for the framework for traditional huts. So traditional mud huts have a framework of poles, but their use is decreasing as people now tend to use a lot of synthetic materials like corrugated iron, for example. We then did detailed studies on high-intensity timber harvesting in Kaba and on bark harvesting in Goma, so at 2 particular sites, and showed that both create forest gaps against a background of reduced tree abundance caused by whole pole harvesting to begin with. So in the case of timber, insectivores, cavity and ground nesting species, and hawking and arboreal probing species, which together comprise most of the forest-dependent species, were negatively affected by habitat gradient from intact sites to canopy gap conditions, while nectarivores, omnivores, and bull cup nesting actually were positive. And in the case of bark, harvesting results in increased habitat heterogeneity, which variably affects avifauna communities at the forest scale, with positive effects in general for positive effects for generalists and negative effects for specialists. Now, the difference between the timber and bark, they both create gaps, but in timber harvesting, the gap is created immediately as the tree is removed. Whereas with ringbarking, then it takes longer to die, and the trees available during this process may be left standing for a long time, and even after it's fallen, it may also be available to the biological community, although it may end up being collected for firewood. So this slide shows the frequency of the most commonly encountered species of bark, again represented as a proportion of identified species. And this time, light gray bars represent again lowland species, but the dark gray bars represent species occurring in both lowland and montane forests. And bark harvesting is widespread, but the montane forests are much more heavily harvested. Bark harvesting is more important, as in contrast to poles, it's not on the decline. With the decline in the use of traditional materials, it's increasing. And the three most important species here, Ocotea ballata is stinkwood, which some of you may be familiar with. So in the time when traditionally it was used for furniture. So I, for example, inherited a stinkwood coffee table from my grandparents, who were married before harvesting of indigenous timber stopped in 1940. But traditionally, in traditional medicine, mostly stinkwood bark is used as a remedy for headaches. And it's also used in various ways by traditional healers for urinary diseases and as an emetic for emotional and nervous disorders, and as steam to treat pimples. Whereas red beech, Proteus, which is the second most common, it exudes a sticky gum, which is used to stick the blade into the shaft when making assicais, which is still used a lot in traditional ceremonies. And the sap is also used to remove hair. And then the Rapanea, the Cape beech, it's used medicinally for respiratory problems, stomach, muscular, and heart complaints. And the bark contains tannin and is used as a charm to protect evil spirits by Nguni people. So timber harvesting, by contrast, is largely confined to coastal forests. And here you can see the frequency of the most commonly encountered species harvested for timber as a proportion of identified species. And the most common is Toroxylon, which is called sneezewood. It's extremely hard and durable, and it's highly valued for timber and for building. The second is Molessia grandis, which is called Mozambique, and it has an attractive brown and white coloration, which is valued for furniture and small domestic implements, and it's also used for making walking sticks and salad bowls, which are sold to tourists. And then the last one here is the red bitterberry strychnach. That's used, in fact, for making implement handles. So getting back to birds, bird primary diet and feeding structure are associated with habitat structure, indicating that harvest disturbance affected community structure. And this solves the paradox of that I outlined at the beginning, that you're getting increased forest cover in this province, but you are getting declining range declines in forest dependent bird species on account of habitat degradation. And frugivores and granivores are, as I mentioned, negatively affected by pole and bark harvesting respectively, whereas omnivores are positively affected by both. And omnivores often tend to be more generalist species. Conversely, timber harvesting negatively affected omnivores and positively nectarivores. Both timber and bark harvesting result in canopy gaps, and this negatively affects species which forage in the understory or on the forest floor. And interestingly, pole harvesting, which reduces tree abundance, but not canopy cover, because the existing trees are able to branch out into the canopy, negatively affected canopy foraging. So in summary, the indigenous forests of the Eastern Cape require urgent management for three reasons. The first is that harvesting is having negative effects on functional diversity as measured in birds, and seems very likely it's the cause of these forest range declines. Second, These forests provide a very important source of both subsistence and income for people in the region, which must be sustained, particularly in the context of the decline in formal agriculture as a livelihood. And this study was done before COVID, but I would be highly surprised if during COVID informal harvesting didn't increase. And third, the reforestation, I should say, associated with this decline in agrarianization provides a source of increased carbon sequestration. But that will endure only in the context of proper management. So I suppose the good news is that the reforestation arising from the de-agrarianization could become what we call a nature-based solution, if in fact it were properly managed. So what would we do, if I was running the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environmental Affairs? And that's the acronym DFFE. In my view, they should consider legalizing timber harvesting of selected species, in effect to regulate what at the moment is illegal timber harvesting. Coal harvesting is of less concern as it's on the decline, going to reduce demand. It's now occurring, it's probably at sustainable levels and is likely to be mostly for household use. However, harvesting a preferred canopy species for poles, so there's certain species that are targeted, that requires better management, as under high extraction rates, these species may become locally extinct. Now, with regard to bark, harvesting for household use is legal, but it's suggested that foresters oversee harvesting in terms of the exemption regulations and record quantities of each species harvested so that sustainable levels can be ascertained and avoid ringbarking, because it's a great pity that this has taken place when it actually can be avoided. So in addition, if forest officers or forest guards were able to keep records of the products collected by individual harvested, that would at least limit this extent of sale by forest products. So, but of course, a large portion of bark harvesting was driven by commercial demand, and it's thus illegal. And as in the case of timber, if legalization of some bark harvesting for commercial purposes could provide maybe for better regulation, I'm sure that local communities benefit from forest products as opposed to middlemen. And assessments, in fact, should be done to determine current stock and devise sustainable harvest quotas. And then for several species, harvesting both timber and bark from the same tree could, in fact, optimize utilization of the resource, so for example, stinkwood. But all of this would require increased numbers of forestry personnel and community cooperation in order to be implemented successfully. And this perhaps is where the true conservation challenge lies. So I'd just like to end by thanking our funders with the Foundational Biodiversity Information Program, which is part or directed by the South African National Biodiversity Institute, but funded by the former Department of Science and Technology and administered through the National Research Foundation. And then the Eastern Cape Parks and Tourism, the National Parks Board, and then the former Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, now Department of Forestry and Fisheries and Environment, there for permitting our field research. And then I'd be very happy to try and take any questions.
Mike, thank you very much indeed for a most informative talk. Could I throw the floor open and ask if anyone would like to ask a question? I am not hearing anything at the moment.
So, Mike, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So having done this very interesting and detailed work, has that now been delivered to some government minister or department?
Yeah. This is a good question, and it's the crucial question. So we reported, of course, back to our the people who commissioned the study, which is the South African National Biodiversity Institute, and they have statutory responsibility for biodiversity in the country. I also contacted, so we had a new government, was formed in 2019, so 3.5 years ago, and I made contact with the new Environmental Affairs Minister, and she said, you know, she asked me to send her a page sort of summary on the results, which I did, and of course I heard nothing. And then about 8 or 9 months later, COVID hit, and you know, everyone went into crisis. But I think the answer is that some attempts have been made, but I think the answer is that I should make more effort to draw more attention to this. It's quite a big, I mean, I'm not excusing the lack of response, but I think she has been quite overwhelmed by a whole host of environmental problems. And, you know, unfortunately with things like this, it's things like, you know, Congress of the Parties that take center stage when environmental problems are discussed. And also, you know, as minister responsible for fisheries, she spends a lot of time dealing with the commercial fishing industry. And unfortunately, what we're talking about here are livelihoods of people who are relatively poor and who don't have any much clout. And of course, they seem to usually take second stage. But it's also unfortunate, I've spoken to colleagues in marine biology, and the same malaise has in fact hit the fisheries division of the department in an analogous form. So 20 years ago or more, due to the work of my colleagues at the Catholic Institute, in particular Peter Ryan, the director, they were able to significantly reduce bycatch of seabirds and other species in longline fisheries just by implementing certain technical measures and putting fisheries inspectors on all the vessels, all the commercial vessels, to ensure that these were implemented. And they significantly reduced the bycatch by 98% or something like that. But again, in the last decade, with all the fisheries inspectors posts being frozen, or many of them, the number of foot soldiers actually implementing legislation has declined. And in that case, you actually have better or more advanced implementation of legislation, which we never really had in the forest sector. And that's become less, much less efficient than it was. So unfortunately, there is a general malaise in government of reducing the number of foot soldiers required and increasing the number of managerial posts of people who are ostensibly managing the situation. So that's a long answer to a simple question, but it's a complex situation.
Thank you very much. And if I may just say, there's an underlying common theme that's present both in the United Kingdom and in our particular case, Brazil, this removal of regulatory people, leading to the kind of issue you've now been outlining. Thank you very much.
Could I follow that up by asking, you talked about an array of different bird species. Are any threatened in particular compared with any of the others? How serious is the threat to the existence of these species you're discussing?
Right. So that's another good question. So I'll answer that by chatting a bit about Cape parrots, because they, in fact, although I didn't put them on the picture, they in fact had quite a large range, perhaps one of the largest, I mean, larger than the 5 so that I showed you. But because this is an iconic species and it's an endemic species and it's an endangered species, a lot of effort has been paid to put into monitoring. And my colleague Colleen Downs at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, they organize a parrot birding day every year, where on one day they try and get a lot of birders out all over all the sort of major forests across the country, and to count the parrots on the same day. So in other words, you don't count any birds twice, because you do it all in one day. And they found that with the parrots, the population size, as measured by the counts on the National Parrot Birding Day, are quite stable, even though the range declines over the last 30 years have been significant. Now, what I measured, because I was, Tessa, my student did, is because we were looking at, was working from SAVAT data, not from field data in that particular study, were range declines, not actual population numbers. But the answer to your question is that this varies, I would suspect, very differently. So something like a parrot, which is a big bird, they're very strong flyers, and they've always been very mobile in terms of their foraging, are probably much less affected than smaller species that are probably more vulnerable. So there's no general answer, but it would be a nice thing to work on a lot of on different species and try and get population data in the same way that they've done for parrots.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Stephen,
are you signaling?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Michael, I wanted to thank you because your presentation and the analysis that you've done, I suspect that it applies in many other parts of the world with the increasing cultivation of the land mass in continents like Africa. Birds really are under threat. But on one specific and tiny point of detail, the barking of trees. If you bark a tree, you kill it. If you only half bark it, perhaps you only half kill it. It gives it a chance to regrow and go on for the future.
Yeah.
Have people investigated ways of getting the bark and the chemicals that they need without killing the tree? Yeah.
So it's really quite straightforward. I haven't done this well, but a colleague I work with, Kurt Geldernes, has done this. And if you take bark in longitudinal sections along the trunk of the tree, and if you do that in a couple of places, the bark simply will regrow in the course of time, and you never interfere with it. You don't, I mean, I won't say there's no reduction in efficacy of the processes of plant, nutrient transport or whatever takes place between the roots and the stems of the trees and the leaves, but you don't kill it and you don't destroy it, and in the course of time it regrows. So there have been education programs in some areas to educate people and to show them how to do it. I suspect most people know that, because if you look at areas where there's heavy barking, like Gomo Forest, where we did a bark-specific study on bark harvesting, as you get further away from the road, almost all the trees are sustainably harvested in longitudinal strips. And it's the trees closer to the road with the easiest of access that are most frequently visited that you get ringbarking taking place. So it's a minority of people who aren't harvesting in a responsible manner. But as more and more people do it, and as it becomes more and more, the key thing I'm trying to emphasize here is that we're talking about something if, 100 years ago would have been entirely non-commercial, and is now, by virtue of urbanization, become a commercial, a commercial enterprise, and that's always when things start getting complicated and start getting abused.
Yeah, thank you very much for your explanation and thoughts. Thank you.
If anyone else has questions, do speak up. I could see Stephen signaling, but there's many people I cannot see. It seems to me in that case, Mike, that you have provided a sufficiently comprehensive overview of the problem to satisfy our audience, for which we are indeed very grateful. I very much enjoyed your talk, and I will now hand over to Chris for his closing comments.
Robert, thank you, and I endorse that. And thank you, Michael, very much. It was an extremely interesting analysis, very, from my point of view as a lay person, a very interesting insight in the way you acquire credible evidence over a range of interlocking activities. So thank you very much. And may I just now thank everybody else for joining us and say bye-bye with a round of applause.